like to call the room to order so we can start this session, this panel on figuring out how to make the CFTA, the Continental Free Trade Area, work for the billions of Africans that we have across the entire continent. We'll try and keep a short, concise, engaging conversation for you over the next hour and a bit. We'll try and stick to the timelines here. It's the afternoon. I know we're looking forward to the gala dinner later on in the day. Maybe a gin and tonic, hopefully produced with content from here. So we'll try and keep this as concise as possible for you. My name is Ramanyang. I'm a business journalist with China Global Television Network based out of Nairobi. We do cover the entire African continent. Occasionally, however, you might see my byline on a story on Bloomberg as well. So if you see me in those two locations, please don't get confused. Like many other Africans, I hold two jobs at the same time. We try and maximize our productivity, right? Right. To get our conversation started, I'd like to bring up Acha Leke. He is from McKinsey. He's running the Africa unit. He's going to set the stage for the issues we're going to be discussing in great detail over the next hour. Acha, over to you.
Thank you, Rama. Can you all see the slides? I guess not yet. Great to be here and to talk about the CFTA. We know it's hugely important for the continent, and so just wanted to a bit of a backdrop presentation as we get into it. And the slides I'm sure are going to come up soon, but let's start from the facts. So as Africa, we import about $900 billion worth of products every day. We export about $800 billion worth of products. So there's a deficit of about $100 billion, roughly equally split between goods and services. I see the slides are not up yet. Equally split goods and services. South Africa alone accounts for 25% of our exports across the continent, South Africa alone. And the highest proportion of imports will come, as you can imagine, from China, India, and the US, right? But again, think about we export 800 billion, we import 900 billion. What we export primarily, okay, I'll continue. Now there you go. So there you go. So I was saying, export 800, we import 900, we have a deficit of 100 billion. And you can see very clearly, and we know this, right? But for me, it was actually when it's visual, right? We basically export, the sort of purple is resources. We export resources to the world, and we import manufactured products. That's exactly what we do. And as President Kagame said today, that's not sustainable. That has to change. The question is, how is that going to change? And part of the issue we have, again, because we do that, the resources we export, we don't export them to the continent, to the rest of the continent. We export them to other regions where they're processed, right? So today, intra-Africa trade sits at 18%. You can say that's great because a few years ago was 16%, but honestly, if you compare it to, East Asia or to Europe or North America, we're far from where we need to be, right? 18% is just not enough. Hence, as we know, we then set up the CFTA to accelerate our intra-Africa trade. And the good news is all countries have signed it. 47 have ratified it, right? So hopefully the others will. And the Secretariat is up and running in Accra, as you know, and we're going through the process of saying, how do we execute on that? And the question is, what has been the pace of execution, and how can we accelerate that pace? Because I think we'll all agree that it's been good progress, but we have to do so much more to get there. Now we've done quite a bit of work with the Secretariat to understand how to do this, right? And the reality is to do this, you actually have to take a value chain approach. And so I'll just share in typical consulting fashion, this 2x2. When we start to help them think about it, you'll see on the x-axis is basically, are these goods produced in Africa today, or are they not produced in Africa today, right? On the y-axis is, are we importing a lot of these goods, or are we not, right? So the top right, these are goods that we produce in Africa today, but we also import a lot of these goods from outside of Africa. So the question there is more of an import substitution, right? How do we make sure we produce more from Africa, and then we substitute the imports we get from the rest of the world? The top left are goods that we import a lot of, right? So the top right, by the way, things like, like cars, things like pharmaceuticals would sit on the top right. Top left are goods where we don't produce today. We produce very little, but we import a ton. Think about the mobile phone, right? Most of our, most of our mobile phones, and you know how many we sell on the continent every year, are imported. Why can't we produce mobile phones on the continent to serve the continent? We have some Chinese companies that all the business is really about producing mobile phones out in China and selling into the continent. How do we replace that? The bottom right are goods that we produce a lot of today, but we actually don't import much from the rest of the world, right? And so the question there is there room to produce even more? Or these goods because there's some goods that are hard to export and every country just has to produce it themselves. Is that the answer for these goods? Or is there room for more intra-Africa trade? At the bottom left are, things we don't produce today that we actually don't import. So there, the answer is very different. It's, are there some that we know we're going to need in the future, and how do we put the basis today to make sure we start producing them? Things like, solar panels or mini grids will be that. So you have to take quite a differentiated approach. It's easy to say we're not producing enough on the continent, we're not trading enough. You have to take quite a differentiated approach, which is what we did. And we said, if you look at this, sort of the easy place to start with are goods that we produce a lot of today, but we also import a lot of, right? So the continent needs it. How do we scale up production on the continent and then use that production to trade within each other and reduce our imports from the rest of the continent? We did these. We looked at a number of value chains with our friends at CFT. I'm just going to give you the examples of 4. The red number is how much of that good is produced in one country and consumed in that country. So 14% of automotives, this is basically Nigeria and South Africa, where we make cars there and then we sell them in that country, right? The blue is basically how much of that good is imported from the rest of the world, and the yellow is how much of it is imported from Africa. That's intra-Africa trade. So you look at cars, right? 14% of our cars are produced locally, but we sell them in country. But 85% of our cars are imported from the rest of the world, and we trade very little with each other. What is the issue there? The big issue there is, half of the imports are actually used cars, right? So how do we then, what are the incentives to produce more locally to replace used cars in a context where used cars tend to be cheaper? So there's a lot of policy implications here. But again, the automotive value chain, there's big issues around thinking about used cars and thinking about what does that mean for policies, and what does that mean for transport of these cars? If you produce them in one country, we're not going to produce cars everywhere, right? But if you produce them in one hub, how do you then transport them around the rest of the continent to sell them? So that's the challenge on automotive. If you take at fish, fish is interesting. 78% of our fish is basically, grown in country and consumed in country. About 16% we import typically from Asia, by the way, and then 6% is traded across Africa. And the issue there with the trade is actually it's more of a production to produce fish. The biggest input is the feed, and feed tends to be expensive. So we looked at this value chain. If you want to really aggressively scale up intra-Africa trade of fish, you have to go all the way back to the feed. How do you reduce the feed cost for the fish so you can produce more and then you can trade more? Again, a different challenge to the value chain. We looked at meat. 90% of our meat, is grown in one country, reared in one country, and in that country we then consume in that country. About 9% is imported for the rest of the world, and there's a small sort of 1% that's imported that we trade across Africa. Again, here it's more about harmonization of standards. So that's more of how do we harmonize standards across all of our countries, so it's easier to export beef from one to the other. And look at pharmaceuticals. 36% we produce locally. We still import 61% of our pharmaceuticals, 61%. And then we only trade about 3% of our pharmaceuticals. Again, the issue in this value chain is more around markets at scale. It's hard to do this in every single market. So how do you build, and you need a minimum scale of these manufacturing plants to make it viable. How do you then produce that scale? And how do you get, I always say, regional integration and regional strategy. So in West Africa, why should, you shouldn't get Senegal and Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire competing to produce the same pharmaceutical product? How do we align better our focus areas through regional strategies? So all this to say the difference, you really need to take a value chain approach and go quite granular to understand what is the constraint to the trade within that value chain. What do we need to do to debottleneck that? And then how do you start to do that across the continent? I'll give you one example of an initiative that is doing just that across Africa, and then I'll close with some ideas. So we've been very involved in the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacture. We all know that we had big issues during COVID, right? Where even here, the president always talks about how, wanted to get vaccines. He actually paid the Serum Institute $6 million to buy COVID vaccines, and then the next day, India locked the borders, right? So he couldn't get the vaccines for Rwanda. And so on the back of that, our governments and our leaders said, look, we can't have this happen again. The reality is 25% of all vaccines in the world are administered in Africa because, as we saw this morning, we have a young population. We only manufacture less than 1%, right? We said, look, what should be the target? And we did all the analysis, and we said the target is now 60%. We want 60% of our vaccines to be manufactured on the continent. So how do you go about it? And so we spent a lot of time with Africa CDC and our friends at the AU to come up with this program. It's called the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing. There's a framework for action. All the ecosystem of players are involved. And there are a number of issues, right? So market design, how do you make sure there's a market for these? When people come and set up a plant here to produce yellow fever vaccines, as they're doing in Senegal, how do you make sure there's a demand for it? By the way, how do you make sure that our governments, if you start producing these, they don't say, oh, well, that's nice and good, but I'm going to buy the yellow fever vaccine produced somewhere else, but not the African one, right? And sometimes you produce these vaccines, actually the biggest buyer of these vaccines is Gavi, right? How do you make sure Gavi buys these vaccines from us? Even though at the beginning, because we don't have the right scale, they may be slightly more expensive than what they would have bought from in India, primarily, which is where they buy, right? What's the process to get there? You have the finance, right? How we have some financiers here. How do you make sure these plans get financed? And I know IFC talked about that earlier this morning, about how he's working with the Rwandan government to really build a life science park here and help finance these plans. You have the technology transfer. How do you make sure that you get the IP here, right? And the technology doesn't always sit somewhere else, and we only here do fill and finish, right? There's the R&D. How do you make sure we have the talent, people who are going to man these plants, who are going to understand how to do vaccine manufacturing? So there are a number of issues across the value chain that need to be addressed. And we created this comprehensive plan, and it's not being executed. We know Rwanda is one of the 5 countries where an mRNA plant has been set up, but it's very impressive. And a lot has happened since then. So all the governments came together and endorsed this. So now it's been endorsed at the African Union level. Gavi, and we worked with them to set up this African Vaccine Manufacturing Accelerator, right? So this $1 billion facility, that Gavi has been put in place. It's been approved by the Gavi board to say, what, we understand that it will be more expensive here for some time. So let's, effectively subsidize the cost relative to what we would have paid somewhere else to make sure that, we can get this off the ground. And by the way, for vaccine manufacturers, here's some startup costs to get you started. So it's actually quite an exciting package of incentives that they've put in place to really promote African vaccine manufacturing. On the back of the AU saying, Gavi, please, we would like for you to make sure 30% of what you buy in Africa for Africa comes from Africa, right? So that was a bit of the impetus for them to do this. We need the NRAs, our national regulatory agencies, to actually get to the right maturity level. So we've been supporting them on doing that. We need the talent to do that. So there's a lot of things that have gone into play to make this partnership happen at a continental level. And so as we start the panel, I just have a few ideas to start. It's great to hear Maktai again this morning talk about this, because I said, what are some of the ideas? We talk about intra-Africa trade. What do we need to do? First and foremost for me is free movement of people, right? Free movement of people. We've talked about it for too long, way, way too long. It's hard to trade with each other if you can't even visit the country, right? As we know, our friends from Europe or the US, can visit more African countries without a visa than we can as Africans, right? So that is the first thing in my mind we should do. The second, I touched a bit about it, is this regional strategies. Every country tends to do their own strategy for this value chain, strategy for vaccine manufacturing, for pharmaceuticals. We need much more. I think our regional economic communities need to play a much bigger role in helping us with these regional strategies so we don't start competing with each other in small markets that really don't have a big scale, right? Let's come up with these regional strategies. The third is we talk about, buying and consuming Africa, but as Aliko was talking about the other days, like, we'll be quicker to buy rice from Bangladesh than we buy rice from Nigeria. Why is that, right? So we put up this Made in Africa campaign and really promote Made in Africa products and make sure that we buy our products. When we start producing these products here, people are excited about buying them. So it's something we've done. We see on the fashion side now. We see on the music side, we're all proud of African music. How can we get that expanded to a bunch of other commodities? Fourth, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that with our panel, is logistics cost. It's still hugely expensive, right? Even the e-commerce players, they can see it's hugely expensive when you buy, whatever you want to buy, a dress from one country and when it's shipped to another country, it's hugely expensive. So what is an integrated plan, more of an integrated plan to significantly reduce our logistic costs, and across all the elements of the cost? And then the last thing I said, I gave you one example of a PAVM. We've done that for vaccines. And I fundamentally believe we need to do that for other commodities. How do we do that for rice, right? How do we come together as a continent and say, here's how much we're importing of rice today. How do we get that to effectively zero, if you ask me? How do we do that for maize? How do we do that for diagnostics? How do we do that for therapeutics, right? So value chain after value chain, how we come together as a continent and make that happen. So some thoughts for the panel. Hope this has been helpful, and I'll hand over to the moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's Chaleke. He's the senior partner and Africa chair at McKinsey & Co. There's a company he referenced, although he didn't actually name it, and I want to see how many of us actually know it. How many of us here, by show of hands, know of a company called Shenzhen Transient Holdings? Just one person. Okay, two. But how many of us have heard of Techno and Infinix, the phone brands? More hands are going up. 2022 revenue is around $8.6 billion. So in terms of opportunity, right, people across Africa actually trading, paying for specific goods with their money, there's an opportunity. And here's a fun fact. When we did a story, this was about last year, trying to actually ask individuals in China, have you ever heard of Transient Holdings? By and large, the response in that market was no, because those products are not actually sold in China. That entire product, that entire firm is focused on doing nothing but business within Africa. So clearly from outside, there's opportunity. How do we make the most of it? Let me bring my panel up so we can discuss that in a bit more detail. I'd like to start with Nicolas Hartini. He's the Senior Vice President in charge of Business Development at MSC, the Mediterranean Shipping Company. Please come up. Also on the panel, Carl Lorenz, Area Managing Director for East Africa at Maersk. Joining us from the Middle East, Mohammed Ali Rashid Luta, the President and CEO of Dubai Chambers. Tejaswi Avasarala, Deputy CEO of the Lagos Free Trade Zone. Serge Ekwe, President of the West African Development Bank. And Kanayo Awani, the Executive Vice President of the AfCFTA Bank and the Managing Director for their intra-African Trade Bank. Please. No, we would never forget you. No, we absolutely would not. But Kanayo, I'd like to start with you on this conversation, because to get to all the things that Acha pointed to here, right? We need a Made in Africa campaign. Obviously, we need products that are made within the continent. We need to essentially build out, right, the next Pan-African vaccine manufacturing system. Obviously, all of these things will need a fair bit of money. But when it comes to trade finance, we talk about this massive gap on the order of at least $80, $90 billion a year. Why does it still exist, and how can we solve it? Is that on? Should still be on. Yeah, that's on now.
Now, let me start by saying thank you for having us on the panel. And decisive decade for intra-African trade. Can the AfCFTA deliver?
Yeah.
In our bank, AfCFTA Bank, we think it must deliver. Because we just talked about sustainability, that we can't keep doing the same things and exporting. Leke just talked about exporting resources in their raw form. Sometimes they're not even raw materials, and then importing manufactured goods. To deal with that, we have to create value chains on the continent. We have to promote intra-African trade, and that's what the AfCFTA is all about, is that you need to ensure that we industrialize and expand those value chains so that we can have a hub and spoke model for most of our processing. Well, in terms of the gap, I think financing is the obvious thing that AfCFTA Bank does. You know, we will finance, but the gap exists because of capital. If we think about all the financial institutions on our continent, I don't even think they size up to one China Exim Bank in terms of their balance sheet. Capital is a key issue. There is this Association of African Multi-Industrial Financial Institutions, AmFI. The AU had made a clarion call for government, central banks to deposit 30% of the resources into these financial institutions.
So we bring some of our reserves out of wherever they're held outside the continent,
exactly,
and deposit them in there.
Exactly. We have to also make sure in doing that, we also have to make sure that financing for us, it helps to make it affordable. There was an earlier conversation at the plenary where the issues of having our resources set in overseas, in reserve banks, in our banks abroad, in central banks abroad, and then we go and then borrow from those institutions at higher costs. So there are a couple of issues. There are issues of capacitizing, our banks, especially the multilateral development financial institutions. There's that issue. There's the issue of bringing our resources back and ensuring that we have access to those resources that are in various banks abroad, and we can use them to on-lend. Well, and in AfCFTA Bank, if I may, for us, it's not just about financing. I know you talk about financing, but the bigger issue in intra-African trade may not necessarily be the financing and the gap.
Okay, elaborate, because I'm going to go to Serge after this.
Should I go ahead?
Yes, please.
It's the facilitation. It's the bottlenecks that are inhibiting the trade. The financing is the problem, but there's the issue of lack of access to market information. There's the issue of cost of foreign exchange, the informality of trade, the infrastructure. They're very obvious, they're obvious ones. And that's why I'm hoping I'll have a round to talk about things like what we're doing in that space to enable intra-African trade, to support the implementation of the AfCFTA. Programs are digital solutions like PAPPS, Trader, even what we're doing in transit, to ensure that goods can move across corridors on a single technology-enabled bond. A couple of things that we're doing, because it's not just about financing. Financing becomes one of the issues, but there are many more.
Right. And I'm sure we'll get to the PAPPS conversation with a bit of interest from TJ later. But Serge, that question around what do we know about our customer? What do we know about this person who's coming over to the bank and saying, I need a letter of credit for X, Y, Z? KYC requirements, because there's this interesting paradox. Bankers will say, I don't know something about this person who wants to import mobile phones, for the sake of argument, from China. Yet this is a continent where, as we heard a little earlier from the CEO of Orange, 70% of people have access to a 4G signal, 90% with 3G coverage. We've got mobile wallets scattered all over the continent. So how do we square that circle? On one hand, there's a KYC problem on the bank side, but on the other hand, we have access to some data about our clients. Is that working? I think the switch is right at the bottom. No, hang on. Try this. All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Well, one or two things. First of all, we all understand now that data is a real asset. We all understand that. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with the KYC and the need now for us to standardize all these processes? Because again, we think that we need a minimum of KYC for sure to avoid, all the drug trafficking, etc., etc. So yes, we need that. It is an international standard. So as we all want to be integrated in the word and international trade, we need to go by these routes, undoubtedly. Africa shouldn't be a specificity. We shouldn't be that specific. We are part of the international world. We are part of the international market. So we need to go to and embrace, clearly embrace this routes. So this is fine. African trade, free trade agreement is not a new idea. It's a very ancient idea. It reminds me of the Lagos Action Plan that was set up in 1980, if my memory is correct, and to be implemented in 2000, where we all back then believed that we would we could fly on our own, we would live, in different planets, etc., etc.
We'd have flying cars.
Absolutely, absolutely. But back then, we all thought that, the time was endless, and we had time. Today, we don't have time. We have to accelerate the pace of our development. I said accelerate, which means that we have to speed up, and then the derivative of the speed is acceleration. For those who are engineers here, it's an acceleration. This is what we need. And the productivity of all of us has increased a lot, a lot. We are able today to do 2-3 things in a row. Today I can even say that we can chew and walk at the same time, all right? So the need for this African trade agreement, free movement of people, free movement of capital, these are the real needs. For example, today we still, when we try to trade between one region to another, very complicated, very complicated. AfCFTA has done a tremendous job so as to facilitate the currency hedging, all right? But even in our region, West Africa, when some of our clients like to move from one region to another, from West Africa to Central Africa, we're supposed to have the same currency, but it's not the same currency, absolutely not. But that does not prevent us from working together. How do we do that? Simple example. We are very close to the Development Bank of the Central Africa, my brothers of Central Africa. We cooperate a lot because we have understood that we have to waive all these barriers between our two regions. So how do we do that? We cooperate, we exchange liquidity, we share projects, etc., etc. These are not, these kind of things are not written in any rules, nowhere. But as we pragmatic leaders, we believe that we have to go beyond this barrier. As a matter of fact, when you look at the policy of the AU today, AU relies on regional unions, right? So it literally means that within our region, ECOWAS, YMU, etc., we need to waive and lift the barriers that prevent us from doing the trade we should do.
Is standardization the ideal way of getting that done, especially at regional levels? Have the same, for example, for the sake of argument, same customs forms, same customs treatment in ECOWAS, same customs treatment in SADC, in EAC, because that way then if Nicolas and Carl's firms are moving goods around the continent, they're not having to deal with, they know exactly what the rules are. Absolutely. They're the same across the board.
Absolutely. That is the objective. But today, we have to recognize and admit that it's easier for our clients to deal between Shenzhen and Lagos or Shenzhen and Lomé than dealing between Lomé and Addis Ababa. This still remains. So we have to work on that, for sure. But the way the banking system is working, and I can tell you, we are setting up alliances on a pragmatical base. It's a real pragmatical approach between AfCFTA, TDB, BIDC, BOAD, who else, BADEA, etc., etc. We are setting up a kind of an alliance, but it's a pragmatic alliance. It's written nowhere that we have to go this way.
Right. To pick up on that transportation question and the ease of movement, Morocco hosted the meetings of the World Bank and the IMF last October. For those of us who are in East Africa or in Southern Africa, to get there, we had to connect through France. So transportation investment is clearly a key bottleneck that we need to fix. And I want to come to you, Nicolas, on this specific question. Given the size of MSC, what are the transport links that you see that need the most urgent investment if we're to make this continental free trade area work?
There are numbers of bottlenecks on the continent, but I also want to be positive. There are a lot of things happening. I want to bounce on some of the figures we saw in the presentation of Acha, which was very clear and very interesting. And just to give some perspective, We saw that today there is about 18% of the trade in Africa which remains in Africa compared to 71% in Europe, 55% in Asia. Just to give you some element of volumes, the intra-Asia trade, this is 50 million containers which are exchanged, 50 million TEUs.
Every year.
And it's a year.
Yeah.
And it's logical because the populations are big, the industries are strong, and the geography makes it that there is a lot of islands, peninsula, and so on. Shipping is the natural way to exchange goods. Intra-Europe, of course, there is a lot of cargo moving by trucks because continental Europe is more compact, is 5 million TEUs. And so 10 times less than intra-Asia. Intra-Africa is 500,000 TEUs, 100 times less than intra-Asia, 10 times less than intra-Europe, which I like to be positive. It means that there is huge potential to grow. What we need, of course, we can deliver the service. You say it's difficult to go from Lomé to Addis Ababa. Yes and no, we can deliver that very easily today. We can do it. There are some bottlenecks, there are some issues, but we do it every day. But what we need is very simple. We need made in Africa. This is something that also came out clearly in the presentation by Acha. We need goods to be able to trade within the African countries. So it is a collaborative effort. We have the policy which is set, this free trade agreement, which is an extraordinary, remarkable one. We know it will take time to be operational. And then we need the banks to do their jobs. We need the shipping lines and the logistic companies to do the lines. And we need the industry to grow. And then the future for intra-Africa will be bright.
Carl, I want to pick up on the optimism that Nicolas put forward for us. Your group CEO has made building the logistic backend. Once that container is landed at the port, it needs to get to a certain destination. And your CEO has made building up the logistics business a key part of the firm's strategy. But how then does that translate into investments that Maersk will make or can make within Africa?
Yeah, thank you. I share the optimism for Africa, and I think just taking a step back then, you know, we have a network of hundreds of ships that are serving Africa at the moment. We're bringing in slightly less than 30%, taking in and taking out slightly less than 30% of the containers on the ocean. When it comes to the land side, let's start at the ports. We have a terminal arm, APM Terminals. They actually had today. They own and operate 10 ports within Africa, admittedly mostly in North Africa and West Africa, with a real ambition to expand that to South Africa and Eastern Africa. I mean, they have a port in Egypt, they have 2 in Morocco, 2 in Nigeria, 2 in Ivory Coast, they're in Liberia, Ghana, the Congo. So once the container lands, you're right, we do have a huge ambition for the land side, and we've acted on that ambition over the last few years. Now, if you just take Eastern Africa as an example, we have 20,000 customers that we serve on the ocean. And those customers all have access to trucking, customs clearance, rail, whatever it might be on the land side. We've taken those 20,000 customers and looked at which of them have a real need for real integrated logistics. And I really like the term integrated logistics plan that was on the slide previously from Acha. In logistics, you know, things go wrong at handover points, particularly in complex markets. And Africa is at this stage a complex market. So if you have many players within the supply chain, then you tend to get issues at handover points. And our ambition and what we're rolling out is that we can offer our customers one throat to choke, or hopefully, as I like to say, one back to pat. And that is that we take care of their supply chain needs from origin to destination, even if that origin is within Africa. So we have built a network of facilities, particularly over the last few years, around these focused vertical customers that we've had. We've really identified what their needs are. For example, on the FMCG side, We've identified their needs. We've set up distribution centers and warehouses in countries like as far as, from Dakar all the way down to Cape Town, all the way down to around to Kenya. And we're offering these customers something they didn't have before, where they used to sell to their country, to their customers only to the port. Now we can take those products inland to a warehouse or a distribution center and then sell on. We've also invested in cold store facilities in South Africa. We have another one approved and going to come up in Kenya. We have a very wide network of container depots. Everyone needs to drop their containers off somewhere, pick them up somewhere. We can get those containers ready, get them delivered. It's the same in the refrigerated market. We've invested in trucks. We've invested in the network that makes sense. Not just investing in the sense that build it and it will come, but looking for customer need and pain points to invest. So we're making progress on that. And
that is the game plan for the future as well. I want to come to the external perspective, right, from Dubai and also from the Lagos Free Trade Zone perspective. Mohammed, Dubai has become this interesting hub for commerce. Not just in terms of transportation, a lot of capital is being sourced from there. We've got a lot of Dubai companies coming in and investing in infrastructure. DP World, for example, setting up in Tanzania, Djibouti as well. From where you stand with the companies that are members of Dubai Chambers, has the CFTA worked for them? Are they seeing a material difference ever since it came into effect?
Well, I'll start by mentioning information about investment that Dubai company made in Africa. In the last 5 years, the investment reached around $48 billion, creating 35,000 jobs. DP World was an excellent example, managing more than 20 ports here. I think the way we look at Africa as a partner, and we always believe that it should be a win-win situation, medium to long term, and this is the best way to deal with the obstacles that my colleague panelist mentioned here. We understand and we look at some of the obstacles in a positive way, that there will be a big area of improvement and development that will create more projects and opportunities. Free trade agreements always help, but I think there are several bottlenecks that will even double the numbers or even triple the number that we just mentioned. In addition to the free movement and improving the logistics, is to create some major reforms around all of the touch points that any investor need in any investment opportunity. So freedom of currency, foreign currency movement, having proper due diligence on medium to large bankable investment opportunities, investment protection, having strong arbitration centers in Africa. I think to take it to the next level, it's very essential to create the ecosystem that supports longer and deeper investments into Africa. We really need to continue creating such ecosystem rather than having fragmented investment opportunities. The numbers are always been very positive. In the last decade, we got a compounded annual growth rate of non-oil bilateral trade between Dubai and Africa, around $477 billion with around 8.8% compounded rate. But to take it to the next level, we really need to create some reform that will encourage new, fresh money coming into the continent. This is one. Second thing, I think, just going back to the expert presentation, it's very essential to create investment opportunities that will export within the continent. So how can we really build opportunities that will serve the growth of the continent? If we look at the chart, that around 18% is taking place in Africa, with the huge population and the youngest population. So what do we really need more? And I think in addition to the freedom of movement and definitely the development of logistics, we really need to have a very solid international standard arbitration center that will serve along with the CFTA that will give the large investor the assurance that their investment, regardless any change of any regime or any policies, is protected.
So Dubai is essentially positioning itself to be that launchpad into Africa.
Currently, yes, and we've been connecting a lot of African businesses into other regions and using Dubai as a platform for their growth out of Africa. In addition to that, we're trying to attract more investment into Africa through Dubai by connecting them with all of the facilities, infrastructure funding, insurance, and all of the requirements that an investor would need.
Well, perhaps Serge and Kanayo might end up, raising capital at some point for Sexim Bank and BOD within the Dubai markets. But TJ, I want to come to you. Reading up on the Lagos Free Trade Zone was interesting. It seems, describing it as a labor of love would probably be a bit of an understatement. Set up in the country since 2002, expanded twice. I believe we target now is to get to 850 hectares in size. And you've set up in Nigeria despite all of the negative things we could probably list, right, about the macroeconomic environment, currency volatility, inflation is back to levels we last saw in 1996. Does your investment thesis for turning Nigeria into a manufacturing and a trade hub still hold despite all the volatility?
Well, thanks. So I would answer it this way, right? If you look at the demand of international companies wanting to get closer to the demand centers, which are based in Africa, there is no dearth of demand. What they need to make that transition happen is a combination of hardware, software, and the spirit. There is no dearth of spirit when it comes to cooperative mentality and trading within African nations. But when it comes to the hardware and the software required to attract that FDI, there is a lot left to be desired. Having said that, what we have learned being in Nigeria for the past 50 years is success in emerging markets and developing economies is largely predicated upon ability to commit for the long term and the ability to deploy a management system that is not run on a command and control basis, rather than an empowered basis where the local people or the local management is empowered to react to the changing volatile environments. But once you do that, and if you are able to provide the hardware in terms of access to reliable energy, access to efficient transport systems, there is a lot of interest in the international companies to get closer to Africa, but there is at the same time a lot of concern in their minds that they will not be able to do it all by themselves. And that is the reason why they look for a lot of local partners. And that is an opportunity area for all of us to tap into, because even if we address the problems that Acha had presented in his presentation, for example, today, when you look at the border crossing times for trade between African countries, it is anywhere between 250 to 260 hours.
And even if you have ships at the port, I mean, like, I know for Nicola and for Carl, they're waiting there for like 10, 15 days.
Exactly.
At best.
Exactly. And there are shining examples of how there are success stories within Africa on how that has changed. If you look at trade between Eastern African countries, the transit time at the border has already reduced to less than 4 to 5 days. If you look at the efficiency of the new port that we have developed in Nigeria, which is
talking about the Lekki port.
It's called Lekki Port. It's the first deep sea port in Nigeria that has been developed in 70 years of independent history. And you called it the labor of love. I would agree with that, but you would have to say that the girlfriend was elusive for 20 years. So, because that is the time that it took for us to put together a deal that was bankable, put together a transaction that we could take to the international market and get the necessary backing of both the off-takers and the investors and everybody that needed to be aligned. But today, now that the port is operational, there are customers located within our free zone that are able to receive their boxes within 48 hours of the vessel arrival. And that, in the context of what the status quo was in Nigeria, is a paradigm shift, because earlier it used to take anywhere between 2 to 3 weeks if you are lucky.
Right. We're getting into the last 10, 15 minutes of this session, so I'd just like to tell our audience, if you've got questions for our panelists, please prepare them now. I'm going to come to you in a bit. But Nicola, I know you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, no, I wanted to react. I heard about waiting times in ports, 5-10 days. This is, of course, not something which is doomed to happen. There are solutions. Carl gave his long list of terminals in Africa, so I have to give mine as well. So we operate as a group, you know, MSC group is made of MSC shipping lines, we have the port entities, TIL and AGL, and then we have the landside organization, Medlog, MSC. In the port side, we have like 25 ports in Africa between the various entities. And I can tell you, we operate, for instance, as MSC, the largest port in West Africa, which is Lomé. Lomé is 2 million TEUs. It's one of the few millionaire ports, if you want, in Africa. And I can tell you there is no 5-10 days waiting time. There is berth on arrival, as we call it. There is efficiency. We have 12 vessels per week which are calling this port and which come and berth on arrival. So it's possible to offer service in Africa. It's possible to offer excellency. And again, talking about the intra-Africa trade, which is the subject of our panel today, we are, as MSC, looking at trade. We follow the cargo, basically. In Africa, if you look at it in terms of intra-Africa, number one is South Africa. Number two, in terms of production, I'm talking goods, I'm not talking oil, I'm not talking... number one is South Africa, logical, industrial country for many years. Number two, Morocco, fast-growing industrial country. Number three, surprisingly, is Tunisia. And number four is Egypt. So what we have done at MSC to follow this trend, to offer solutions to the African traders, importers and exporters, we've set up one service coming from South Africa, going and only staying in intra-Africa, not going to Asia, not going to Europe, going to west coast of Africa, all the way to Lomé, stopping in all the intermediary ports. And we've done the same on the east coast, from South Africa all the way to Mombasa. So to offer African importers and exporters solutions. Another things we've done, again, we follow simply we are here to accompany trade. Egypt is a huge, Madam, you know you are based in Cairo, is a huge exporting country to Africa. So we've established a direct service from Egypt into West Africa to work there again, offer direct solution, fast solutions to facilitate the trade and operationalize the free trade agreement.
The conduit around the continent
Correct.
Exist.
Yes, so it's happening today. There are solutions. Any port pair can be offered at any time for our African customers. So there are solutions already in place.
Right. I know you wanted to come in on this.
No, actually, he's answered the question. I actually wanted to ask Maersk and MSC how they can help solve the problem of maritime logistics. That's what I wanted to ask, because, you know, otherwise, I do know that the cargo is not there in the way, you know, you're giving us the statistics on the containers. I'm sorry, I'm taking over your job.
Go for it.
But, you know, we can't leave this panel without solutions today.
No, we have
a challenge, we need to solve it, you know, because I know you follow the cargo. The cargo is a chicken and egg situation. You know, there's no product, you know, but we don't have the transportation. And there are discussions about, do we have an Africa-focused, set up our own Africa line? Maybe that's a solution to drive. So I'm glad you talked about it, but, you know, it's solution time, you know.
Carl?
Yeah, Nicholas touched on the maritime side, the ocean side. You know, we also MSC, Maersk, all our competitors have a lot of vessels coming in and out of Africa, and I think that's what you've seen over the last few decades. Is that if you go back 30 years, being in Africa, you know, once you were in, it was a barrier to entry to anyone else because the ports couldn't really handle anyone else. Now it's become more of a commoditized product with the port examples that we've both brought up. So you have a lot more vessels coming in and out, and you can cross-load on a vessel that's going between ports and really service any port within Africa. I think the real connection issues happen within the continent on the land side. And, you know, customs was brought up earlier. Borders are a real issue within Africa. It really is mind-blowing that some African countries would rather export to another continent than to move to the neighboring country. And a lot of that has to do...
Is that a standardization problem, or is it a non-tariff issue in the sense like what we see, for example, in East Africa, where you wake up tomorrow, Ugandan authorities want to export milk across the border. The Kenyan authorities are like, no, we want to protect our Kenyan farmers.
Yeah, it's a short-term view, in my view, and it's about collaboration and making sure that those what on a map look like simple moves are made much more efficient. So let's talk about customs. If you're crossing many borders, land borders within Africa, customs is an issue, and it can take days to get your container cleared and across, and then there's more hurdles and things come up overnight. That needs to be streamlined, and we need to rely on technology to streamline that. That's just one of the examples of what we can do.
So like e-invoicing, for example?
Yeah, well, the customs clearance process, right, between two countries. Okay. Special economic zones need to be set up. So we really need to take a longer view as the private and the government sectors and work together to take a longer-term view on saying, how can we really facilitate this trade so we can take that 18% and make it 50%?
Okay, 30 seconds each, Nicolas, then I'll come to TJ, then we go to the floor.
Okay, but we offer the solution. The solutions are there, and we offer them. And the border crossing, again, it's solvable. Let's take two examples. And this morning we heard about the leadership issue. And today, to pass the border, we are in Kigali, to pass the border for a container between Tanzania and Kigali, it takes 30 minutes. To go across the Zambian border, if you want to export a container or shipment of copper from, let's say, Kolwezi to Durban or Dar es Salaam or the other gateways, it takes 10 days to cross the border. So why can we do it in 30 minutes in Tanzania and Kigali and 9 days in Zambia? So the solutions are there. It's just the drive, the leadership, the willingness to eliminate bureaucracy, but it can be done. And we have to look at the positive examples and then bring the best practice.
And then scale those up. TJ, then we go to the floor.
Yeah, just in the spirit of solutions, just a question for all of us to brood on. Now that we know from Nicholas and Carl that intra-African port connections through transport corridors on the shipping lines are already existing. Despite that, if the trade volumes are what they are, less than 500,000, we need to ask ourselves why. And the answer that I can think of is it's simply not productive enough or efficient enough to produce in Africa in comparison to importing from other areas of the world. And that is despite the relatively lower cost of labor, because the other factors of production, like access to reliable power, access to technology, access to internet, and all these things basically continue to tear away at the productive positioning of manufacturing within Africa. Despite availability of transport corridors, if we can't solve these problems, we will not be able to unlock the potential that we are talking about.
I wanted to react.
Sure, go for it.
That's good.
So he's losing his job.
I'll send her the invoice in USD later.
No, okay, you go ahead. Look, I think we already know those challenges. Infrastructure is a huge one. But you are in the free zone. The reason that it works, industrial parks and special economic zones work. They work in areas where infrastructure is problematic. You know, we can't accept a situation where we'll continue to import because we cannot do anything about it. The reason we're all here on the panel is to do something about it, to set up those industrial parks. I do understand the challenges, and that's why for us at AfCFTA Bank, Industrialization is at the forefront of what we do, and that's why we support value chain expansion. That's why we support industrial parks. You know, we're invested in our RISE IIP because we noticed that they are homegrown industrial parks that can help us solve the problems of industrialization and manufacturing, and to deal with the supply side constraints that we mentioned, so that the odds are against us. You know, the trade routes are all wired towards extra-African trade. And it's not just the extra-African trade that is the issue, it's the fact that the extra-African trade in natural resources. Right. Meanwhile, when the shocks happen overseas, we bear the impact. You had the presentation on COVID and the vaccine manufacture. We couldn't even manufacture, so we have to do the manufacturing here. And I'm glad you're already doing something about it.
But if that's the case, because to use the Lagos Free Trade Zone as an example, it's a 20-year labor of love, right? But between the Afreximbank and the BOAD, if TJ comes to you and says, look, I need patient 20-year capital, can he get it?
Okay, so my answer to that is that between Afreximbank and BOAD, we've done industrial parks in Benin, in Togo. Thank you.
I would just add, Madame is going to get our email tomorrow.
Serge, if you want to weigh in.
Oh, yeah, I mean, 20 years tenure for a trade, yes, of course, we can do that, easy. We have
Single
set up,
digits?
yeah. The framework is there. We can even insure it. There's no
Okay,
issue.
perfect. So
No
when you're
problem.
sending all your pictures to him, please write the checks
of course,
accordingly.
Senior debt, of course, yeah.
All right, I know there are questions that are in the floor. There's a gentleman right at the back, and then we'll come to the lady in the front. Do you have the mic? Yeah, it's on now.
Yes.
All right. Very briefly, sir.
Yes, very brief. Thank you so much. Thank you for the panelists, and I think the discussions were quite insightful. So for me, my observation generally for AfCFTA is that I think it's a problem of facilitation, and I think we continue to propose technical solutions to problems that have to do with sovereign concerns and implementation capacity. The challenge we are really facing is we get commitments from political leaders, but really the people that have the responsibility to execute these commitments may not have the capacity that these initiatives desire. So I'm of the opinion that in thinking a way forward, we need to stop, most of the solutions around products are long-term. It will take 20 years like the examples we have talked about. You can imagine one free trade zone taking 20 years. You can imagine how many projects we have to execute.
So we need to devolve, do we need to devolve powers then to individuals and let them actually make those decisions themselves?
No, so my thinking is that let's focus more on the soft side of implementation. Things that we can easily do, the low-hanging fruits, things that don't require investing $20 billion, investing $100 billion. It starts with, do the people in those countries agree, or they are only speaking with their mouth, but their minds are not aligned? So for example, like the examples that were given here today, Kenya wanted to do visa on arrival. It didn't take a year. And some countries have been talking about visa on arrival for 20, 30 years. So I'm thinking, let's focus more on the soft side. The capital issue is there.
Okay.
We see most of the banks leaving Africa, the foreign banks and all that. So we need to start thinking about those things we can do that are very easy, very simple, and don't require
So we grab the low-hanging fruit, make the most of that.
Yeah, thank you.
All right then. Can we have a mic on the front, please?
Thank you. So my question is to Nicholas and Carl. There's still a bit of volatility in Africa. Sudan war, Red Sea, flooding in Kenya, dark congestion. So what solutions are you coming up with for our customers or our exporters and importers in promoting intra-African trade amidst all this volatility? Specific solutions that you have come up with.
Okay. Nicolas, Carl, do you want to take that?
You know, our job is to offer solutions. So the secret of our job is reactivity, flexibility, solution, imagination, because we are confronted on a daily basis to issues. And this is what we are good at, is to find the solutions, to be imaginative. But at the same time, we are faced, I just want to give one example of the things we need to solve all together. In his presentation, Acha gave a very good element about automotive. And indeed, there is a good automotive industry in South Africa, in Kenya. But today, when an exporter from South Africa is producing cars in South Africa, wants to sell them in West Africa, he goes via envelope. That's crazy. That's where we have to come up. That's where we have to collaboratively find the solutions. Why can't we simply, and why can't we do it? Is because you have the frame policy, but you don't have the operationalized solution.
So the ideas up here are not translating into actual changes in policy.
And this is costing money to our African fellows. So this is where we have to focus. Finding so on our side, we can provide the solutions, but we need also the support and the leadership locally from the respective governments.
All right, Carl?
Yeah, I mean, let me combine and answer with both of the questions. I think the soft skill question and what are we doing, you know, rather than come up with examples of what we're doing, I think we need to really, and picking up on what Nick said, I think we really need to focus on collaboration and coordination between the private sector and the government sector. This is not going to be solved through a panel over here. We've all got some good suggestions and responses, but then we go home and then what happens, right? We need to find a way that the private sector and the government sector can collaborate to, you know, like the gentleman in the back there mentioned, take the low-hanging fruits and say, right, for this corridor, how can we make it easier for the African customer, the African exporter and the African importer to export and import from different countries? And what do we need to do? And maybe we need to take a little bit of a long-term look and forego some short-term revenue for a border crossing or a trucking rate or whatever it might be, knowing that we can build a specific sector up. And that takes collaboration between the private sector and the government sector and coordination. And I think we need to set up those forums to be able to authentically drive that forward rather than you know, pointing fingers at each other.
Indeed. I don't think I can find a better way to actually wrap up this session on looking for solutions, collaboratively working together. And hopefully, when we meet here in 5 years' time, we'll be having a completely different conversation about building out value chains where I can import a BMW from South Africa and hopefully surplus milk from Kenya and Uganda will be heading finding its way into markets, perhaps with your clients over Nigeria, TJ. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings our panel to a wrap. A round of applause, please, for our panelists, Nicolas Sartini, Carl Lorenz, Mohamed Ali Rashid Luta, TJ Abasarala, Serge Jekwe, and Kanayo Awani. Thank you very much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.